Imagine this. It is December 25th, 1989. A bitter winter grips Romania. The air is sharp, the snow on the streets dirted by the boots of soldiers and the tires of armored vehicles. Television sets flicker across the world. People gather in living rooms, offices, and cafes, not just in Bucharest, not just in Europe, but across the entire globe. What they're about to see is something so shocking, so raw, that even hardened Cold War veterans struggle to believe it. A dictator and his wife, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, are led before a hastily assembled military tribunal. Their faces are pale, their voices defiant. Cameras roll, questions are shouted. The world watches as history unfolds in real time. Minutes later, gunfire crackles. The Ceaușescus fall, and with them, one of the last Stalinist regimes in Europe collapses before the eyes of millions. But how did Romania get here? How did a man who once seemed untouchable, a man who rubbed shoulders with Western presidents and communist leaders alike, end up executed by his own people? And what role did outside forces, particularly the United States, play in shaping these events? This is the story of the rise and fall of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. It is a story about power and paranoia, about propaganda and betrayal, about the way ordinary people can endure decades of fear and then suddenly, explosively break free. And most importantly, it is a story about how America, though far away, was never just a spectator. I was born out of revolution, not me as a storyteller, but Romania itself as a nation. Romania, throughout the 20th century, lived between empires, between great powers, between East and West. And it was in this crucible that Nicolae Ceaușescu rose. Nicolae was not born into privilege. He came into the world in 1918, the same year the First World War ended. His birthplace, Scornăsesti, was a small, poor village in southern Romania. The child of peasants, Nicolae grew up in hardship. Poverty etched itself into his worldview. From an early age, he saw wealth and power concentrated in the hands of the few, while the many struggled to survive. But Nicolae was not content to remain a poor villager. At just 11 years old, he left home and went to Bucharest, the capital. He apprenticed as a shoemaker, but work was not his passion, ideology was. The young Nicolae found himself drawn to the underground Romanian communist movement, which at the time was banned and heavily persecuted. In those smoky backrooms and whispered conversations, Nicolae Ceaușescu was shaped. He was imprisoned multiple times in his youth for his political activity, and it was in prison that he encountered the man who would become his mentor, George Dej, the future communist leader of Romania. The prison system was, in many ways, the communist school. Behind bars, young radicals were educated in Marxist theory, revolutionary tactics, and the value of loyalty. Nicolae soaked it in, and more than that, he developed a reputation. Quiet, disciplined, a man who kept secrets. By the time World War II ended and Romania fell into the Soviet sphere of influence, Ceaușescu had positioned himself well. The Red Army's presence in Eastern Europe after 1945 transformed Romania into a communist state. George Dej rose to power, and Nicolae was pulled into the machinery of the new regime. He worked tirelessly, not as a public speaker or an intellectual, but as an organizer, a functionary, a loyalist. Nicolae's first years as leader surprised many. In a region dominated by Moscow, Romania under Ceaușescu began carving out its own path. He refused to let Soviet troops remain on Romanian soil. He denounced the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact, standing against the Kremlin at a time when few dared to. In the West, he was praised as a maverick communist, a man with an independent streak. American presidents noticed. Richard Nixon visited Bucharest in 1969, the first U.S. president to visit a Warsaw Pact country. Ceaușescu was hailed as a new kind of communist, pragmatic, nationalistic, even reformist. For a moment, Romania was not just another Soviet satellite. It was something different. But behind the image lay a darker reality. Ceaușescu was not reforming his country. He was consolidating power. Slowly, He built a cult of personality that rivaled Stalin's. His portrait hung in schools, factories, offices. His speeches were broadcast endlessly. His name became synonymous with the state itself. And by his side, always, was his wife Elena. Elena was more than just a first lady. She styled herself as the mother of the nation, a brilliant scientist, a visionary. In truth, much of her academic reputation was manufactured, but in Romania's propaganda machine, she was untouchable. Together, Nicolae and Elena became not just leaders, but symbols, elevated above ordinary citizens, worshipped in state media, feared in private conversation. Life in Romania grew harsher. The 1970s saw massive borrowing from Western banks as Ceaușescu dreamed of rapid industrialization. But when the global economy shifted, debt mounted. To pay it off, Ceaușescu imposed brutal austerity. Food was rationed. Electricity was cut. Heat in the dead of winter became scarce. Children grew up malnourished. Ordinary Romanians lived in fear. Fear of poverty. Fear of the dreaded Securitate, the secret police who listened, watched, and reported. And yet, the regime projected strength. The Ceaușescus traveled abroad, receiving red carpet welcomes. In the United States, Britain, France, and beyond, they were treated as honored guests. Behind the scenes, the West valued Ceaușescu as a wedge within the Soviet bloc, a communist who did not always follow Moscow's orders. But the cracks were already forming. To understand the collapse of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, you have to first understand the strange world they built around themselves. Because by the 1970s and 1980s, Romania was no longer a country with leaders. It was a country where leaders became gods. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the boy from Scornăsesti, had remade himself into the genius of the Carpathians. That's what the newspapers called him. That's what television anchors repeated with robotic devotion. And that's what millions of Romanians were expected to say out loud, in unison, with no hint of sarcasm. The propaganda was endless. Nicolae's speeches were printed in thick books, distributed to schools, studied in workplaces, quoted in factories. If he spoke about agriculture, farmers were expected to repeat his wisdom. If he spoke about science, engineers nodded as though his words were revelation. If he mentioned world peace, foreign policy experts called it profound. And then there was Elena. Elena Ceaușescu. If Nicolae was the father of the nation, Elena positioned herself as its mother. She was awarded countless academic titles. Official biographies declared her a world-class chemist, a scientific genius. She was paraded as a role model for women, intelligent, powerful, and devoted to her husband. But the truth was more cynical. Many of Elena's supposed scientific achievements were either stolen, fabricated, or handed to her by frightened subordinates. It didn't matter. In Romania, truth had no space. What mattered was the image, the illusion. And the illusion was carefully crafted. Nicolae and Elena were not just rulers, they were destiny itself. The cult went deeper. Their birthdays became national holidays. Their portraits filled classrooms. Children sang songs praising them. Factories and towns were renamed in their honor. Newspapers described them in glowing, almost biblical language. The sun guiding the Romanian people, the beacon of socialism, the supreme intellect. Every public gathering became a theater. Crowds rehearsed their applause. When Nicolae Ceaușescu stepped out onto a balcony, tens of thousands of hands clapped in perfect rhythm. No one dared to be the one who clapped too softly, too late, or not at all. Because in the crowd, there were always eyes watching. The dreaded Securitate. The Securitate. Romania's secret police were among the most feared in the entire Eastern Bloc. They had informants everywhere, in schools, in factories, in apartment blocks, even within families. A careless joke, a whispered complaint, a small act of defiance, all could end in an interrogation room. The result was a society frozen in fear. People learned to speak in codes, to trust no one fully. Parents warned their children never to repeat what was said at home. Friends avoided political conversation. The Ceaușescus did not just demand obedience. They demanded silence, complicity, and the suppression of truth itself. But here's the contradiction. While Romanians suffered at home, abroad Nicolae Ceaușescu was still being courted as a kind of independent communist leader. Western nations, including the United States, admired his break with Moscow. They admired his rejection of the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. They admired his seemingly nationalist stance. So, as Romanians lined up for hours to buy bread, as power outages left families shivering in candlelight, Nicolae and Elena traveled the world in luxury. Limousines, banquets, medals, and handshakes with presidents and monarchs. This was their reality. And it wasn't just for show. Ceaușescu played a clever game. He borrowed heavily from Western banks, billions of dollars, to fuel his vision of rapid modernization. Steel plants, factories, grand architectural projects. Romania looked, on the surface, like a nation on the rise. But debt is a merciless master. By the late 1970s, the bills came due, interest payments soared, and Ceaușescu made a fateful choice. Instead of restructuring, instead of negotiating relief, he announced that Romania would pay off every cent of its foreign debt, no matter the cost. The cost was paid by ordinary Romanians. Imports were slashed. Food, fuel, electricity, everything was rationed. Supermarkets had empty shelves. Meat, milk, even basic necessities became luxuries. Hospitals ran out of supplies. People fainted at work from hunger. Children grew up smaller, weaker, hungrier. And still, on television, Nicolae spoke of progress. Elena spoke of scientific achievements. The propaganda grew louder, more absurd, as reality grew harsher. By the 1980s, the gap between illusion and truth had become a chasm. Romania was a country with two faces, the glossy face of official media and the gaunt, pale, weary face of its people. And it was this contradiction, this unbearable tension, that would eventually break. Because no cult of personality, no matter how powerful, can forever hide the pain of empty stomachs, freezing homes, and lives lived in fear. By the 1980s, the gap between illusion and truth had become a chasm. Romania was a country with two faces, the glossy face of official media and the gaunt, pale, weary face of its people. And it was this contradiction, this unbearable tension, that would eventually break. Because no cult of personality, no matter how powerful, can forever hide the pain of empty stomachs, freezing homes, and lives lived in fear. By the early 1980s, Romania was a country living in the shadows of hunger and silence. And yet, if you turned on the evening news, you would have thought you were watching a fairy tale. The anchors smiled. They praised the party. They praised the Ceaușescus. They reported record harvests, record production, record happiness. But step outside into the gray streets, and reality told another story. Shops were empty. Shelves displayed nothing but jars of pickles and vinegar. Bread was rationed. Meat became so rare that families slaughtered pigs in secret, terrified that neighbors might report them to the Securitate. Cooking oil, sugar, flour, these were luxuries. Housewives stood in line at dawn, waiting hours, sometimes for nothing. Winter was worse. The state rationed heat and electricity. Entire apartment blocks froze in the dark. Families huddled together under blankets, cooking on improvised stoves. Television was restricted to just 2 hours a night, and even then, most of that time was filled with speeches by Nicolae or Elena. Imagine living in a world where light, food, and even words were rationed. The Ceaușescus lived differently. Inside their palaces, tables groaned under banquets. Elena wore imported furs and jewelry. Nicolae traveled with an entourage of luxury cars. Their children received French perfumes, Italian clothes, Western gadgets. And yet, the propaganda told Romanians that their suffering was patriotic, a noble sacrifice to free the nation from debt. And Ceaușescu kept his word. By 1989, Romania had indeed paid off its foreign debt. It was one of the only countries in the world to do so. But the cost was a decade of starvation, a lost generation of children weakened by malnutrition, and a population scarred by fear. And fear was everywhere. The Securitate, Ceaușescu's secret police, grew into one of the most pervasive surveillance networks in the world. Historians estimate that 1 in every 10 Romanians was an informant. Imagine that for a moment. Your neighbor, your coworker, your childhood friend, even your spouse, could be reporting your every word. Families whispered at the dinner table, afraid their own children might accidentally repeat something at school. The Securitate listened to phone calls. They opened mail. They followed people on the street. They tapped walls. They planted microphones in apartments. They filmed gatherings. They recruited spies with threats and blackmail. No thought was private. No life was safe. This was a Romania of the 1980s, hungry, cold, and watched. But repression carries a paradox. The tighter the grip, the more people dream of slipping free. By the mid-1980s, cracks began to show. Small acts of resistance spread quietly. Underground jokes, smuggled foreign broadcasts, whispered prayers in churches. Radio Free Europe, broadcast from the West, became a secret lifeline, offering Romanians a glimpse of truth beyond the Iron Curtain. The regime called it Western lies, but for many, it was the only voice that made sense. And then came whispers from abroad of a changing world. Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union had begun to speak of reform, of glasnost and perestroika. Eastern Europe stirred with protest. In Poland, the solidarity movement was gaining ground. In Hungary, cracks appeared in the wall, but not in Romania. Ceaușescu rejected all reform. He insisted his system was perfect. He declared socialism eternal. He doubled down on control, on propaganda, on fear. Yet history was already shifting beneath his feet. By 1988 and 1989, Romania was a pressure cooker with no release valve. Internationally, the winds of change blew hard. The Berlin Wall was trembling. In Warsaw, Lech Walesa was negotiating the end of communist rule. In Budapest, Hungarians debated free elections. Even Moscow was no longer the iron master it had once been. But in Bucharest, Nicolae Ceaușescu stood stubborn, immovable, deaf to the world around him. He believed Romania was immune. He believed the people adored him. After all, they still clapped at his speeches. They still cheered in the streets. The cult of personality had worked for decades. Why would it collapse now? But the clapping was no longer real. The cheering was hollow. And deep down, Ceaușescu must have known. Meanwhile, daily life reached unbearable limits. Blackouts became routine. Hospitals turned into morgues of neglect. Mothers buried children who never had enough to eat. Rural villages were bulldozed in Ceaușescu's mad project of systematization, destroying homes to force people into soulless concrete blocks. The country looked like a stage set. Giant boulevards, empty shops, glittering palaces, and behind it all, a silent, suffering people. And then, in December 1989, in the city of Timișoara, the silence broke. It began with a small act of defiance. The government tried to evict a Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes, for criticizing the regime. But the congregation refused to let him go quietly. Crowds gathered outside the church. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They shouted slogans, not just for the pastor, but against Ceaușescu himself. The Securitate opened fire. Blood stained the streets. But something had changed. Instead of frightening people back into silence, the bullets ignited fury. The protests spread. Timișoara rose. And soon, the entire nation followed. December 1989, Romania was a nation on the edge. In Timișoara, the spark had already been lit. Crowds had faced the Securitate and refused to disperse. For the first time in decades, fear broke. People shouted, "Down with Ceaușescu! Liberty! We want bread!" The army fired. Blood ran in the snow. Dozens, then hundreds were killed. But something remarkable happened. Instead of silence, Romania erupted. On December 20th, Ceaușescu returned from a state visit to Iran. He was furious when he heard about the protests. In his mind, Romania was stable, perfect, adored. How could anyone rise against him? He called the protesters hooligans and traitors. He ordered the army to crush them without mercy. But this time, the army wavered. Soldiers hesitated to shoot. Some even joined the demonstrators. Ceaușescu sensed danger, but still, he believed he could control it. On December 21st, Nicolae Ceaușescu tried his ultimate weapon, the carefully staged mass rally in Bucharest. It had always worked before. Tens of thousands of workers were ordered to attend. Loudspeakers blasted the party anthem. The dictator stepped onto the balcony of the Central Committee building, raised his hand, and smiled. The cameras rolled. The whole nation watched live. At first, the crowd clapped, as they always did. But then a sound pierced the air. A murmur, a shout, then whistling, then chanting. For the first time, the cheers turned against him. On live television, Nicolae Ceaușescu froze. His face twitched with confusion, then panic. He raised his hands, begging for calm. Comrades, be quiet. His voice cracked, but the people no longer listened. The illusion shattered. That moment, those few minutes of hesitation, broadcast across Romania, marked the death of his power. The whole country saw their great leader exposed as weak, frightened, human. By nightfall, Bucharest was in chaos. Crowds filled the streets, clashing with police and the Securitate. Tanks rolled in. Gunfire echoed through the city. On December 22nd, the impossible happened. The Romanian army switched sides. Soldiers joined the people. Armurat Baiclas Ruyet Bazida Protesteros. Barricades went up. Inside the Central Committee building, panic reigned. Ceaușescu tried one last speech, but no one cared. The crowd stormed the building. And then came the iconic moment. A helicopter landed on the roof. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu scrambled aboard, fleeing the capital as their empire crumbled beneath them. For hours, the Ceaușescus raced through Romania in confusion. Their convoy of cars and helicopter hopped from town to town, desperately seeking loyalty. But everywhere, they met rejection. The once feared couple were now fugitives. Soldiers arrested them near Targovist, stuffing them into a small garrison. And then came the question, what to do with them? On December 25th, 1989, in a drab military barracks, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu faced a swift, improvised tribunal. The charges: genocide, corruption, destruction of the economy, abuse of power. The evidence: the suffering of an entire nation. The trial lasted less than an hour. The Ceaușescus shouted, insulted the judges, refused to recognize the court. Nicolae declared, "I'm the president of Romania, and I am still your commander-in-chief." But no one listened. The verdict was death. Outside, soldiers dragged the couple into a courtyard. Television cameras followed. The world watched as history reached its brutal climax. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were tied to poles. A firing squad lined up. Elena screamed, refusing a blindfold. Nicolae sang the Internationale. And then, the roar of rifles. It was over in seconds. The images spread across the world. The only time in history that a dictator and his wife were executed on live television during Christmas Day. Christmas 1989 ended with silence in Romania. The Ceaușescus were gone. Their portraits ripped down. Their statues toppled. The cult of personality that once seemed eternal vanished overnight. But the scars remained. Decades of fear, hunger, and silence do not disappear in a single day. And yet, Romanians had proven something extraordinary. Even under one of the harshest dictatorships in the world, the human spirit could not be crushed forever. The December Revolution was not just the end of a regime. It was the rebirth of a nation. December 25th, 1989, the execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. For the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, Romanians awoke to a country without their beloved leader. The news spread like wildfire. Ceaușescu is dead. Crowds cheered. Strangers hugged in the streets. Flags with the communist emblem cut out in the center fluttered across Bucharest, a symbol of a nation reborn. But beneath the joy, fear lingered. Gunfire still echoed in the night. Snipers, loyal to the Securitate, were said to be hiding on rooftops. No one knew if the violence was truly over. Freedom had come suddenly, chaotically, violently, and the people of Romania stood at the threshold of a new and uncertain age. Into the vacuum of power stepped the National Salvation Front, NSF, a hastily formed council led by Ion Iliescu, a former communist official who had fallen out with Ceaușescu years earlier. Iliescu promised democracy instead of dictatorship, free elections instead of staged assemblies, open press instead of censorship, bread and warmth instead of hunger and cold. Romanians desperately wanted to believe. After decades of suffering, the dream of freedom burned bright. But already, cracks began to show. Many whispered, is Iliescu really different? Or is this just communism with a new mask? Freedom did not immediately mean prosperity. Shops were still empty. The factories, once forced to overproduce for Ceaușescu's insane debt repayment plan, now stood idle. Workers feared layoffs. In villages, peasants who had lived under collectivized farms wondered if the land would finally return to them. In cities, families sat in apartments with flickering lights, still rationing food, wondering when things would change. For the first time, Romanians could listen freely to Western radio, watch foreign television, and even dream of traveling abroad. But for many, daily survival was still the same struggle. The revolution had ended one nightmare, but it had not yet brought the dream of prosperity. The fall of Ceaușescu came at the perfect moment for the West. The Berlin Wall had fallen only weeks earlier. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe were collapsing like dominoes. And for the United States, Romania's revolution was a powerful symbol of victory in the Cold War. Almost immediately, America extended aid. Humanitarian supplies, food, medicine, blankets were flown in. American diplomats met with the new Romanian leadership. Radio Free Europe broadcast messages of hope. President George H.W. Bush praised the bravery of the Romanian people. But beneath the celebration, Washington also had strategic goals. Prevent chaos in Romania that might destabilize Eastern Europe. Ensure Romania's loyalty in the new post-Cold War order. Protect Romania's resources from falling into the wrong hands. Thus began a long, complicated relationship between post-communist Romania and the United States. The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu was cheered by many, but also troubled others. Why no real trial? Why such a rushed execution? Why on Christmas Day? Some believed it was necessary, the only way to prevent Ceaușescu loyalists from regrouping. Others believed it was a cover-up, a way to silence the dictator before he could reveal names, secrets, and international deals. For decades after, Romanians would debate, did justice truly prevail, or was it simply revenge dressed as law? Even without Ceaușescu, fear lingered. The Securitate, once the most feared secret police in Eastern Europe, had not simply disappeared overnight. Many officers melted into the shadows, reinventing themselves as businessmen, politicians, or power brokers. Ordinary Romanians wondered, who can we trust? The man next to you in the cafe, was he once an informant? The new politician on TV, was he once a loyal party member? Freedom had come, but so had suspicion. In 1990, Romania held its first free elections in more than half a century. Crowds lined up to vote. Hope surged. Ion Iliescu and the National Salvation Front won in a landslide. But soon after, protests erupted. Students, intellectuals, and workers filled University Square in Bucharest, demanding a cleaner break from communism. What followed shocked the world. Iliescu called in miners from the Geo Valley to crush the demonstrations. Armed with clubs, thousands of miners attacked protesters, beating them savagely. The event became known as the Mineriad. Romanians realized the road to democracy would not be straight nor smooth. The shadow of the past still clung tightly. Throughout the 1990s, Romania struggled to transform. Inflation soared, corruption flourished, but slowly, painfully, the nation moved closer to the West. In 1993, Romania applied to join the European Union. In 1997, it began formal negotiations with NATO. By 2004, Romania became a NATO member, embraced as part of the Western Alliance. And in 2007, Romania officially joined the European Union. What began with blood and chaos in December 1989 eventually led to Romania's integration into the Western world. Today, Romanians remain divided in memory. Some recall Ceaușescu as a monster who starved and terrorized the nation. Others, especially the older generation, remember him as the leader who kept Romania independent, who built apartments, who made the country debt-free. The debate lingers. Was he a tyrant or a patriot gone mad with power? But one fact is undeniable. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu's deaths on Christmas Day, 1989, marked one of the most dramatic and symbolic ends of a dictatorship in modern history. The revolution was not the end, but the beginning of a long, uncertain rebirth. Romania emerged wounded, divided but free, and behind the scenes, America and the West shaped the nation's path, ensuring that Ceaușescu's fall was not just Romania's revolution, but also a triumph of the global struggle against communism. The echoes of those days still live on, in the streets of Bucharest, in the memories of survivors, and in the lessons of history. Freedom, once won, is fragile. Democracy, once begun, must be guarded. And every nation, no matter how dark its past, can find a way to begin again. The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu in December 1989 was a brutal end, but it was not the end of Romania's story. It was the beginning of a new, fragile chapter. The 1990s in Romania were a time of contradictions. Hope and despair, progress and corruption, dreams of freedom clashing with the ugly leftovers of dictatorship. Romanians woke up each morning in a country that was free, but not yet stable. They had cast off the heavy chains of Ceaușescu's rule, but now faced the heavy responsibility of building a new Romania. The first decade after the revolution was not easy. Economy in crisis, inflation skyrocketed, state-owned industries collapsed, unemployment spread through cities and villages. Families that had survived austerity under Ceaușescu now faced hunger again, but in a new way, not from rationing, but from poverty. Corruption everywhere. Former communists rebranded as businessmen and politicians, grabbing industries, land, and wealth for themselves. Unfinished justice. The killers of December 1989 were rarely punished. The Securitate melted into society, some quietly joining the new government or starting private security firms. Romanians often asked, "We have freedom, but is this really the life we dreamed of?" Yet, despite the pain, seeds of change were being planted. The United States saw Romania as a crucial piece in the new European puzzle. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. But Washington wanted to make sure Eastern Europe stayed in the Western orbit. And Romania, once one of the most repressive communist states, became a test case. American diplomats, military advisors, and economic experts poured in. Aid programs supplied food, medicine, and technical support. Romanian officers began training with NATO. Western companies explored Romania's oil, gas, and manufacturing sectors. For many Romanians, America became not just a distant superpower, but a symbol of hope, a model of democracy, and a partner for their fragile new future. Romania's path toward NATO was long and rocky. In the early 1990s, the country was unstable, scarred by violent protests and corruption scandals. But by the late 1990s, a new determination emerged. Romania wanted to prove that it belonged in the West. In 1997, President Bill Clinton visited Bucharest. His words electrified the crowd gathered in Revolution Square. "You are not alone. America stands with you." In 1999, Romania supported NATO during the Kosovo conflict, even though it was not yet a member. Finally, in 2004, Romania officially joined NATO. It was a turning point. For the first time in its history, Romania was not trapped between empires. It was part of a powerful alliance, protected by the world's strongest military. For Washington, Romania was more than a new ally. It was a strategic partner, a bridge between Western Europe and the troubled Balkans, and a key player on the Black Sea. If NATO gave Romania security, the European Union offered prosperity. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Romanians endured painful reforms: privatization, restructuring, anti-corruption campaigns. Old industries collapsed, but slowly new businesses emerged. Villages connected to highways, airports modernized, and cities like Bucharest and Cluj began to look more like Western Europe. In 2007, Romania officially joined the EU. For many, it was the final confirmation that their sacrifices since 1989 had not been in vain. Romania had returned to the European family. The nightmare of Ceaușescu's isolation was over. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 reshaped the world and Romania's relationship with America. Romania quickly offered support to Washington, sending troops to Afghanistan and later Iraq. Romanian soldiers fought and died alongside Americans. In return, the U.S. strengthened its military presence in Romania. Bases were built. Joint exercises were held. By the late 2000s, Romania was no longer just America's ally on paper. It was a true partner in global conflicts. For ordinary Romanians, this partnership brought mixed feelings. Some were proud that their nation stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Others worried, are we being used as pawns in America's wars? Even as Romania embraced the West, Ceaușescu's shadow refused to vanish. Many older Romanians looked back with nostalgia. At least under Ceaușescu, we all had jobs. At least the apartments were cheap. At least we weren't flooded with Western corruption. Younger generations, however, viewed him as a tyrant who stole their parents' freedom and nearly starved a nation. This divide continues today, a generational split in how Romanians remember their past. But one truth remains. The revolution of 1989 set Romania on a path that, despite hardship, led to NATO, the EU, and integration with the Western world. Now, in the 21st century, Romania stands at crossroads. It is firmly part of NATO and the EU. Its military works closely with the United States, especially in the Black Sea region, countering Russia's influence. Its economy has grown, though corruption and inequality remain. Its people enjoy freedoms that would have been unthinkable in Ceaușescu's time. Free speech, free travel, free elections. And yet, challenges persist. Many young Romanians leave for Western Europe seeking better pay. Corruption scandals still rock governments. The wounds of the 1989 revolution remain only partially healed. But through it all, one lesson echoes. Romania is no longer isolated, no longer trapped. It has found its place in the Western world, and in partnership with America, it continues to navigate the uncertain waters of the 21st century. The Ceaușescus died on a cold December day in 1989, but their story did not end with the bullets of their execution. It continued in the struggles of a nation trying to rebuild itself, in the uneasy embrace of democracy, and the handshakes across the Atlantic that tied Romania's fate to America's vision of the world. From dictatorship to NATO, from hunger lines to the European Union, from isolation to partnership, Romania's story is not one of instant transformation, but of slow, painful, often frustrating rebirth. And through it all, one question lingers, one that still divides the nation. Was a revolution of 1989 the beginning of true freedom, or simply the end of one tyranny followed by new chains? On Christmas Day, 1989, the Ceaușescus fell not just as individuals, but as symbols. They had lived as though they were untouchable, rulers of destiny, gods in human form. Yet, in the span of a few days, the people they had oppressed turned against them, and their empire of fear collapsed like paper in the rain. Their execution was not merely the end of a dictatorship. It was the end of an illusion. That power built on fear can last forever. The Romanian Revolution holds up a mirror, not only to Romanians, but to the world. It asks every nation, every leader, every citizen, what happens when power becomes unchecked? What happens when a leader confuses themselves with the state? And what happens when people decide that enough is enough? The answers are not found in books alone. They are written in the blood spilled on the streets of Timișoara, in the gunfire that echoed through Bucharest, and in the silence that followed the last words of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. The revolution of 1989 was not only a Romanian struggle. It was part of a wider drama, the end of the Cold War. And America was watching closely. Some say Washington gave the green light. Some say it simply waited, ready to embrace whatever new government emerged. But there is no doubt, America's influence shaped what came after. It helped Romania find its way into NATO and the EU. It stood as a protector against Russian influence. It offered aid, guidance, and sometimes pressure for the United States. Romania was more than a distant ally. It was proof that freedom could triumph in places once thought hopelessly lost to dictatorship. But freedom, as Romania discovered, is not automatic. It does not arrive like a package dropped from the sky. It must be nurtured, defended, and built every single day. Romania's first years of democracy were messy, filled with protests, corruption, and disappointment. But perhaps this is the real lesson. Freedom is never perfect, never easy. It is a living thing, fragile and yet powerful. What happened in Romania in 1989 resonates far beyond its borders. In the Middle East, dictators watched in fear. If Ceaușescu could fall so suddenly, so could they. In Africa, strongmen learned that alliances with foreign powers were not enough to protect them from their own people's anger. In Asia, reformers studied the revolution, hoping to avoid Romania's chaos while still breaking free from tyranny. And in the United States and Western Europe, Romania's story became a reminder of why democracy must never be taken for granted. More than 3 decades later, Romanians are still divided in how they remember Ceaușescu. Some say he was a monster who destroyed the nation. Others whisper that life was, in some ways, simpler under him. Younger generations, born after 1989, struggle to understand why their parents still argue about a man long dead. This division is not unique to Romania. It is a human truth. Memory is complicated, and the past refuses to vanish. But perhaps that is the greatest warning the Ceaușescu story offers. The fight against tyranny is not just about toppling one leader. It is about healing a society for generations to come. As Romania entered the 21st century, America's role evolved from liberator to partner. Bases were built, troops trained side by side, economic ties grew, and in the process, Romania transformed from a forgotten corner of Europe into a frontline state in the struggle between East and West. For America, Romania is a reminder. Democracy abroad is fragile, but vital. If it fails, the consequences ripple across continents. If it succeeds, it becomes proof that freedom is not only possible, but worth fighting for. The story of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu is not just about Romania. It is about the arrogance of power, the courage of ordinary people, and the complex hand of foreign influence. It is a story of how quickly empires can fall and how painfully nations must rebuild. It is also a warning. Every dictatorship believes it is eternal. Every tyrant believes the people are too weak, too afraid, too divided to rise. But history tells us otherwise. In December 1989, a nation once silenced found its voice, and the world was reminded that no throne, no army, no cult of personality can withstand the will of a united people. So, when we look back on those final days of the Ceaușescus, the rush trial, the gunshots, the silent cameras capturing their fall, we're not only witnessing the death of 2 dictators, we are witnessing the rebirth of a nation scarred, imperfect, struggling, but free. And perhaps in that freedom lies the greatest lesson of all, that tyranny can end in a single moment, but the work of building democracy lasts a lifetime.